Webinar entitled Diving into State Data, How the Deaf-Blind Child Count Data Can Help You. My name is Will Iserman, and I am the Associate Director of the National Center for Hearing Assessment and Management, known as NCHAM, at Utah State University. NCHAM serves as the National Technical Resource Center for EDI, the EDI NTRC, funded by HRSA, to support a wide number of stakeholders in and around the EDI system. And as a part of that, we offer webinars like this on a fairly regular basis. I want to give a shout out to our interpreters and our captioner today, to our background technical support folks, for helping us make this webinar as accessible as possible. So thank you to those of you who are playing those roles today. From a perspective of logistics, know that today's webinar is being recorded, and what that means is in the next couple of days, you can access the video recording of this webinar on our website, which is infanthearing.org. So keep that in mind. If there's a particular slide or comment that you want to come back and review again, or if as a part of your experience today, you think of folks that would benefit from today's webinar who aren't attending live. So you can always refer them back to infanthearing.org. On our landing page, you'll find a list of webinars and how to access the library of all of those that have been recorded in the past. So keep that in mind. This is a coffee break webinar, so it's going to be time limited. Our speakers today are going to speak for about 15 minutes, and then we're going to open up the Q&A field for you to make comments or questions to have our presenters respond to, and we'll do that. And we'll let you know when to submit your questions. Hold them until you are invited to do so. We're not going to monitor those until it's time. I think that's everything by way of logistics. So our webinar today is looking at is being provided by folks from the National Deafblind Child Count to highlight etiologies and causes of deafblindness, such as charge syndrome, complications due to prematurity, postnatal complications, Usher syndrome, congenital CMV, and Down syndrome. They're going to explain trends nationally over the last 3 years, discuss differences between birth to 3 and 6 to 21 populations in terms of etiologies and identification, and share resources specific to the different etiologies that may help inform your work. Our presenters are Emma Nelson, Emma Fricky, sorry, Emma, and Carly Rhodes. I'll let Carly Rhodes, boy, sorry for that. I'll let them each give you a little bit more details about the roles that they play. So without further delay, I will introduce Emma and Carly. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be with you all today for this coffee chat. Understanding data trends is a critical part in the identification and referral efforts for infants and toddlers who are deafblind. Today, I'm so happy that Carly is here to share a snapshot of common etiologies and causes and the trends we've seen over the last 3 years. So this will be a short sort of snapshot coffee chat, and then we will have a slightly longer presentation at the EDI conference. Many infants who are deafblind, who are identified early, have been identified through the newborn hearing screening. And we believe there is immense opportunity in the partnership we have to develop with all of you to increase our understanding of each other's data, priorities, and needs. So without further ado, I'll hand this over to Carly, and we really look forward to having a fruitful discussion following Carly's presentation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Carly Rhodes, and I basically get to have this awesome opportunity to talk to all of you today because I am a great big data and numbers nerd. I am the data and evaluation manager for the National Center on Deafblindness. And one of the really big tasks that I'm in charge of is basically managing the national database that we have that counts all of our children with deafblindness. And this is from birth to age 21. Although some states do provide services past the age of 21. So like Michigan, for example, serves students until age 25. So Michigan reports their students until the age of 25. So there is a whole lot of information and data surrounding our database, and I'm just giving you guys like a little taste today about what exactly is our database, what kind of information can you find there, and then I have some little graphics to share with you to look at some of the trends specifically for younger kiddos, as well as a little bit of a comparison between what's going on birth to 3 as opposed to our 6 to 21 years kiddos, and all that really great stuff. So I'm just going to go ahead and dive in because I have a lot to say and not a lot of time to say it. There we go. All right. So just to reiterate what our purpose is today, we're going to be highlighting some common etiologies and causes of deafblindness. We're going to be looking at some specific trends of the top etiologies that we typically see with the students that are reported for the child count. We're going to look at the trends nationally over the last 3 years for birth to 3, as well as a little glimpse at 6 to 21, although our main focus will be birth to 3. We'll discuss some of the differences that we're seeing in the trends of birth to 3 versus 6 to 21 in etiologies and identification. And then I'll also talk about some resources specific to different etiologies that may help inform your work. So what exactly is this child count? And I figure we might be coming from a place where we don't know exactly what this is. You know, like, what is this database? And I'm sure some of you may have never heard of it before. This is something that started back in 1986. So this has been around for about 38 years at this point. And this is a national child count of children and youth who are deafblind, and it collects information on this population of children that have been identified with deafblindness in the United States and some U.S. territories. So like the Pacific Basin and the U.S. Virgin Islands are included in this. And it's about birth through age 21, again, with some of those states going past the age of 21, which are rare cases. And then with the onset of the pandemic, we had some kids that were given special dispensations to stay longer to receive services. So we have some interesting numbers in the last couple of years with some older kids staying until age 22, 23, but we'll start to see that drop off as the years continue. We collect a ton of data within this database, and this includes both state and national information. We have things including population demographics. This includes age of the students, race, ethnicity, gender, where they're living. We have an optional language spoken at home category. We also collect information about the type and severity of both vision and hearing loss, the cause and etiology of the deafblindness, if there's the presence of additional disabilities, education setting, living setting. We collect Part B and Part C information. So, you know, what types of services they're receiving, where in the school they're receiving those services, what types of assessments they're getting for standardized assessments, like pretty much almost anything you could think of that's you might be interested in. I'm pretty convinced our database would have that information available. So since we are talking about the child count, I did want to just show you guys where this is on our website and take you on just like a little quick website tour of this. So I'm going to exit out of my PowerPoint and bring up this website.
You got it. It's perfect.
Great. Wonderful. So it's nationaldb.org/info-center/national deafblind-child-count. And if you ever are just on our main webpage, you would go to the Info Center tab here at the top and then click on National Child Count. And that brings you to our main page for the National Child Count. You'll see my smiling face there on the page. So if you need to contact me, my email address is there. And this gives a little bit of an overview of like what exactly, a little more in depth about what the National Child Count is. Some little quick links here on the side for our data center. We've got like a really great in-depth paper about students with significant cognitive disabilities and dual sensory loss that we partnered with the Atlas folks about. So we have lots of great information on this webpage. If you scroll just a little further down, this is where you can access all of our reports. And this goes all the way back to 2004 up to present. We did just publish the report for 2022. I don't see it up here yet, but that is available. So we have that ready to go. And we have both HTML and PDF versions going back to 2017. And everything about the report is there. The HTML version has like different categories and you can zip around in the different tables and different sections of the report that way, or you can download the PDF version and look the report as a whole all at once. So I just wanted to show that really quickly. Let's see if I can remember how to bring up my, all right. I think we're good to go. Yes, perfect, wonderful. You would think by now I would be a little more versed with Zoom, but sometimes it's still a little bit of a learning curve. All right. So the first thing I wanted us to look at were some trends from birth to age 3, just over the last 3 years, like looking at what's been going on with our numbers, what kinds of things are we seeing, and those sorts of things. And I do want to point out that when you take the totality of the kids that are identified birth to age 3 and you're comparing them from like 6 to 21, which, you know, are the Part B older students, there is a pretty huge gap in how many kids we're identifying. And I have a graphic later to show specifically about that. Something else to keep in mind too is on average every year for the child count, we are identifying in the ballpark of about 10,000 kids. I think for the most recent year, 2022, we were in the upper 9,000 range. So on average, you know, kids with deafblindness, this is like a rule of thumb, it occurs, it's a low incidence disability. It's occurring about 1 in every 10,000 kiddos. And we are finding about 10,000 kids every year with our child count. That's not to say we're finding every single kid under the sun, because as we know, there's all kinds of barriers to identifying these kids. But I will say that we have a huge difference in the numbers that we report on our child count as opposed to what gets reported with OSEB. They receive their information through IDEA and have way, way, way lower numbers than we do. This is partially due to issues such as kids with deafblindness just being labeled as having multiple disabilities on their IEPs, or school districts not counting all of the eligibility categories, so deafblindness isn't being counted. There's lots of different issues for why that is happening, but I like to think that our numbers are more accurate. We receive our information directly from state deafblind projects, and you know, numbers are not perfect. You know, they come from every single state, and every state handles their data differently, and there's always room for improvement, but I think our numbers are closer to accurate than what OSEP currently has. So looking at this particular graphic on the screen, so for like top 6 etiologies, typically tend to be charge syndrome, CMV, Usher syndrome, Down syndrome, and then deafblindness that results from complications of prematurity. And then there's also a category of postnatal or non-congenital. So for the purposes of looking at birth to 3, I did these 6 for each age so we could kind of see like if there's any differences between the ages. So if they're under the age of 1 year old, these are our trends from 2020, 21, and 22. And something that I want everyone to keep in mind is that, of course, 2020, how could anyone forget that was the year the pandemic happened? And because that was such a rough year, the world shut down. It was really hard to get numbers in, to find kids, to get identification. We typically saw a bit of a dip in numbers that year. So for a lot of these trends you'll see, then in 2021, we see a really big spike in numbers because compared to what happened in 2020 when the world was shut down, we're suddenly finding a whole bunch of kids. That tends to even out a bit in 2022, but the numbers do generally tend to still be higher than they were in 2020. So numbers have been kind of up and down in the last few years. I think that's something really important to keep in mind, but we are seeing some stabilization over time. Ideally, in a perfect world, we would see our numbers continue to increase, as we get better at identifying kids, as we improve with, our identification processes, but always room for improvement, of course. So typically in terms of syndromes, our top syndrome is almost always charge syndrome. And you'll see that it is definitely the case for kids under the age of 1 year. And they had the biggest jump in 21, and then they eased back down in 2022. The next most common one was postnatal non-congenital, then CMV, then complications of prematurity, then Usher syndrome. And then what's interesting on this graph is Down syndrome actually went down in numbers in 2021. And I'm not exactly sure why that is. I think it's definitely worth looking into at some point, but that is something to note and something you'll see on some of the other graphs that for some reason Down syndrome took a big spike down in 2021 as opposed to these other syndromes. Looking at our age 1, basically typically very similar to our kiddos that were under the age of 1. We do see a sharp increase in charge syndrome from 2020 to 2022. And again, but for most of the others, we're seeing, an increase from 20 to 21 and then back down a bit in 22. The only exception here being, again, Down syndrome, which is steadily going down for kids that are age 1. For age 2, we actually, as a bit of a change here, we see a decrease in charge syndrome over time, although that seems to be leveling out as well. Usher syndrome also went down in 21 for kids that were age 2. So just interesting trends to note. And if you'll note on the side too, the numbers again are pretty small when we're talking about, the entire country of the United States. So very, very small numbers. And then age 3, this is perhaps the most interesting, that these numbers are a little bit larger in comparison to the younger kiddos, but not seeing a lot of changes over the years with this age group. So just very small changes for these kids. So then I just wanted to do a comparison of the total number of identified kids from birth to age 3 over the last 3 years. So from 2020 to 21 to 22. You'll see with the kids under age 1, we have what we would typically expect, that from 20 to 21, there was a little bit of an increase. And then in 22, a little bit of a decrease as the numbers start to stabilize, but still higher than the numbers in 2020. For kids in the age 1 category, we see actually a steady overall increase from 20 to 21, then to 22. Then for age 2, we see again what we would typically expect, going down in 21 and then back up in 22. And what I actually find super fascinating is for our age 3 kiddos, we had a ton of kids that got identified in 2020, and then we saw a huge decrease in 21, and those numbers still haven't really recovered too much in 22. So I think that's really interesting to consider, thinking about when are kids actually being identified, when are we seeing them come onto the child count, and all of those sorts of questions. And then my final graphic for you all, because I'm sure not everybody is as excited about numbers and data as I am. I didn't want to bore you all too much. But these are the top etiologies for the last 4 years. And this is a comparison of birth to 3 versus 6 to 21. Oh, no, it's specifically for just the year 2022. But these were the top 4 etiologies for 2022. And it was complications of prematurity, charge syndrome, if there was no determination of etiology. And then we have kind of a catch-all category of other that tons of kids fall into typically. And if you look at the orange line, that is the 6 to 21 kiddos, and the blue line is 0 to 3. And you can kind of see there is quite a huge gap, because our 0 to 3, like the highest number it looks like on there is hovering at the 200 mark, whereas the highest number for 6 to 21 is, well over 1800. So really, really, really big difference. And this is really telling about how quickly kids are getting identified when they're coming on to the child count database. Lots of implications for receiving services, all sorts of things. So I just wanted to touch on some potential issues just surrounding identification that we typically tend to see serving students with deafblindness. First and foremost, there seems to be a real common misunderstanding just around the term deafblind. We see a lot of people, families, professionals that have not been exposed to deafblindness before, and they think, oh, this student's not deafblind because they're not completely deaf and completely blind. And I will tell you, if you look at our database, you would actually find that only 1% of all the kids on the database are completely deaf and completely blind. Deafblindness is a spectrum in terms of vision and hearing, and there's all sorts of combinations that come with that. So a lot of people don't understand that just because you're not totally deaf and totally blind, that you can still qualify as being deafblind. We also typically see a lot of delays in this whole process of diagnosis, referral, and actual implementation of services. There is a great academic article that I believe is by Boyer, Hatton, and Ivy that was done in 2010. It's a little bit old, but it's the most recent one that we had, that was looking at the top 3 conditions of severe uncorrectable visual impairment and what the delays were between diagnosis, referral, and services. And even if a child was diagnosed within 3 months of birth, they oftentimes were not receiving services until they were well almost 2 years old. That is a huge, huge, huge problem. So again, that's causing issues around identification. There is also sometimes perceived stigma. I served as the director of the Oregon Deafblind Project for a couple of years, and I definitely had a lot of conversations with families that were just absolutely not, my child's not deafblind, that's not my kid. And again, that's that whole misunderstanding about what deafblind means, and people not understanding and being nervous about that. So sometimes that impedes kids getting identified and being put on the child count database in a timely manner. And then, of course, an issue around identification, that pesky pandemic that I'm sure everybody's sick of hearing about. Our numbers are really, truly beginning to, finally stabilize in the year 2022. I'm excited to see our numbers and data for 2023. Typically, state deafblind projects, our data submission window opens March 1st and closes May 1st, typically. So it's going to be soon time for states to start submitting their data for 2023. And I'll be really curious to see if our numbers are continuing to stabilize or if, we see like a really wild increase or decrease. You never know what's going to happen. But definitely the pandemic had a huge, huge impact on identifying kids and getting the proper numbers. And that's why with a lot of those graphs that you saw a really big jump in almost every single category from 2020 to 21 because of the pandemic issue. So if we, just to give you guys some questions to consider when we open the Q&A. I do know I've talked a bit, so we might not have time for all of this, but if you want to talk about some trends that you're maybe seeing with early identification in your area, what you think might be some other issues impeding identification, and if you have any sources or supports that you know of that could be helpful for increasing early identification, feel free to sound off about any of this or additional questions in the Q&A. And I did want to throw up my email address and Emma's. I have standing office hours that anyone is welcome to attend on Thursdays for an hour at 3 o'clock Eastern time. So if you ever have a question about the database, if you have a request for specific numbers to be pulled, anything like that, I'm always happy to talk about that. And if, of course, if you can't come to those specific office hours, I can meet and talk to you in other times as well. I just like to have a standing office hours, and I get random people that pop by all the time. So at this point, I'll kick it over to the question and answer section. I think I see a couple of comments maybe in there.
Yeah, so we invite you to use the Q&A box into which you can type your comment or question. And the first one is, with many states passing laws dealing with congenital CMV, can people still refer the kids to their state deafblind project or NCDB if a child has asymptomatic CMV? Because hearing loss and or vision loss could manifest later. Or do they have to wait until the symptoms are present?
That's a great question. So just to clarify, NCDB, we don't do referrals. It's the State Deafblind Project specifically that do. And honestly, that is a call that varies from State Deafblind Project to project. I know, like, for instance, when I ran the Oregon project, we would welcome and put kids on the database that may not have a profound hearing and vision loss at the time, but if it was, it was coming and we knew it would be deteriorating, we wanted to go ahead and get them on the database and start them getting services and those sorts of things. It just really depends on the state. Every state has slightly different eligibility requirements for deaf blindness. Some states, if you are eventually going to qualify for deafness and blindness, they will go ahead and put you on there. But some states, you have to meet like a minimum requirement for like eye acuity and those sorts of things. So it just really varies depending on what your state is.
And this is Emma. One additional piece, like what Carly was saying, and I see Heather Dirks. We have a number of State Deafblind Project folks on this call. So hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. But Heather wrote, we are seeing an increase of much earlier diagnoses of Usher syndrome, specifically in babies 3 to 9 months old, versus when they start losing their vision in their teens. This has been very impactful for families to get support and be proactive instead of reactive. And that's so true. And I think, Heather, you're in Iowa. So it's great to hear that's what's happening in Iowa. I know, for example, in Arizona, if kids are identified through genetic screening for having Usher syndrome, they are not able to be placed on the child count based on the eligibility requirements, but there is a lot of information that's being disseminated about that. And so it's kind of this waiting in the wings. Here's what you can do in the meantime. There are some great resources that we worked on with the Usher Syndrome Foundation around early identification and early supports, which I can be sure to share as well.
So a question from Illinois. Why delay to provide services for deafblind babies until age 2? This person says, I am from Illinois and I work with the Hands and Voices Guide by Your Side Parent Guide. I had a child with deaf blindness.
So I don't think it's necessarily a rule that services get delayed until age 2. I was referring specifically to a data study that was done in 2010 that saw, like, on average that there was a delay between diagnosis and referral, and then referral and implementation of services. And, just based on my experience, it's just bureaucratic red tape, like that tends to happen. Like, it could be that there's a diagnosis at birth and a misunderstanding that deaf blindness applies in that case. So then the referral and services part, like, doesn't happen until much later. There's lots of reasons that could be happening. But, historically, I think those delays do tend to happen. And I think education is really key for combating that, making sure that, like, medical professionals know that, hey, if we have a baby that's been diagnosed, with Charge syndrome, for example, that we might want to hook them up with their state deafblind project, things like that.
Yeah,
So I want to oh, go ahead, Emma.
Sorry. Yes, and one additional piece that I think is so important and why you all might be getting tired of hearing from us so much is the importance of partnerships, because there's a very large difference between identifying kids as deafblind and having them on the child count, and then actually having families receive technical assistance from state deafblind projects. So state deafblind projects maintain their state deafblind child counts, de-identify the information, and report them for the national child count. And that information is critical for us and for the Office of Special Education Programs, so that we can have a strong understanding of these trends that Carly has shared about who is deafblind within the United States and about what kind of services and supports they're receiving. And that really then helps us to define how we all do our jobs at state deafblind projects and at NCDB. So having a strong understanding of what this data looks like is one piece. And then there's this piece of technical assistance to service providers, technical assistance to families, which Dana Kahn talked a lot about at the webinar in November. And that is optional. So if families aren't necessarily ready to receive technical assistance from state projects, there is still an opportunity for them to be on this national child count. And I think that has not been solved yet, is how do we talk to families about this child count without necessarily overwhelming families or making the assumption that oh, there are so many people already on the team, we don't want to add one more person. There's so much there, and I think the only way that we can figure this out is by having those open discussions with each other and really brainstorming how that can happen. And that would be state by state. But yeah, that's a soapbox you guys hear me talk about all the time, but it's an important one.
You talk about state by state engagement. How can state EDI program staff support the deafblind population and these counts, both in terms of accessing services as well as in getting an appropriate count?
That is the golden question. And I love that you asked that. Partially, that's this work that we're all doing together. Some of you I know are attending a work group after the EDI conference where we can have this conversation and really start digging into what that looks like. I think that there are a number of different states who are doing a number of different things. For example, I know some states are working on MOUs between their EDI programs and their deafblind programs around some data sharing. There's additionally some questions with really, and actually next month in February, the Minnesota Deafblind Project is going to share how they're really working on integrating questions around vision so that it can become more, and Anna, I don't know if you want to write in the chat anything specific, but they're really working on integrating questions about vision so that potentially vision can be identified earlier. Another piece is just really talking about what that referral process can look like, how that can be completed and by whom. Anyone can refer. And so let's see, is there anything else, Carly, that you would add to that list?
Well, I want you to say again what's happening at the end of the conference.
Oh, sure. So we are so excited to have the opportunity to partner with all of you after this conference to have a work group. It's going to be a small group at the actual conference, but then this work can continue on with a larger group. And so for interested people who really want to dive into this question, it will be how can state deafblind projects, and there will be state deafblind project folks there, as well as Eddie and Hands and Voices, partner better to support families by identifying kids as early as possible. And I think we all recognize that so many different hands are in so many different pots. And then there's, etiology specific supports. There's so many different supports. And so by putting all of the questions on the table and working together, I think that hopefully we'll get somewhere. And so this work group will be on that Wednesday after the Eddie coordinators meeting and the family-based organization meeting. It'll be that afternoon on Wednesday. And we'll meet from 1:30 to 4. We'll have coffee, tea, some snacks.
And if somebody wants to participate, how do they let you know?
Sophie Page sent out an email. I think it would have been through the National Center for Hearing Assessment and Management. I believe she sent that a few weeks ago, and then she sent it out again either yesterday or today. You can also just email me directly if you're interested.
And Emma's email is on the screen right now. We realize that some people are needing to go, but we can stay on for a bit longer and answer a few more questions. So I cut you off, Carly. Did you have something to add to what Emma was just saying?
No, I just wanted to, really, reiterate like how important this work is, just because, the faster we can identify these kids, the faster they can get referred and the faster they can get services. And we all know how critical early intervention is, and just like how important it is like that these kids are getting intervention as soon as possible. And, I think at the core, that is really like why this is so important.
So
Yeah.
the next question. I'm a nurse with three children, two with Usher syndrome, type 2. I went back to school and became a teacher of the deaf and also help out with the Idaho Eddie project. I refer kids to Idaho Deafblind Project for my 0 to 3 students. I think there needs to be more education for teachers of the blind and teachers of the deaf to bring this up with parents. Also, I think referral to genetics in terms of Usher syndrome will help, as often those don't get diagnosed until much later. I had genetics done very early and am so glad I knew earlier. So that was a comment, essentially. Any responses to that?
No, I think that's a really great point. And again, just knowledge is power. And, I do think, that in personal prep programs, like, TBIs and TODs, like, do need to be taught more about deafblindness and what a state deafblind project is and those sorts of things. And there's definitely lots of room for growth and improvement.
Next question. Do you have statistics on the numbers of deafblind children who use ASL?
So yes and no, and I hate to have to say that. So we do have a category that asks like what the primary language spoken at home is, but the thing is that's an optional category, so not every state collects data on that. So, and again, only if the primary language in the home is ASL, like would they be reporting that. So unfortunately, we don't have like a lot of hard data about how often ASL is being used with the kids.
The other piece with that is that it's possible that your state deafblind project does. They oftentimes certain states may collect more information than what is reported on the National Child Count. So they may have that information and you could reach out to them. There is a state deafblind project directory on the National Center for Deafblindness website. If you scroll down, it says contact your state deafblind project at the bottom, and then you can scroll through the directory and they might be able to give you that information, or at least a ballpark.
Two wrapping up comments, and then we'll tie it up for today. But before you all go, look in the chat field where you will see a link to an evaluation for today's webinar that will also generate a certificate of completion for today's webinar, if that's important for you to document. So please look there before you run off. So a couple final comments or questions. Somebody typed in that Babies Count, babiescount.org, tracks babies who are blind. It might be another good partner to reach out to, as some may have deaf blindness.
Yes.
And then
can I say one thing super quick about that? Yes, absolutely. We have been having some preliminary conversations with them. One of the interesting things is that often the same person that would submit the babies count information may be the same person who would confirm the state deafblind project child count information per year, or may submit that referral. And so often that person could be the same person. And so it's always an interesting thing to have conversations about, for sure.
Yeah, there's people who wear multiple hats. Just a question about the post-conference meeting. Is there any chance of virtual participation?
For that first meeting, there will not be. However, going forward, that is a very brief kickoff to really think about and put just all of the things we can think about on the table. And then from there will definitely be continued opportunities for this partnership and for conversations, whether that be through Zoom and breakout rooms or other things like that. And so definitely stay tuned for that information, Teresa.
One final question. So this person, maybe there's two final questions. This person writes, I'm a teacher of the deaf and would like to know if you have any ideas about how to get our district to use deaf blind on the IEP instead of multiply disabled. Any thoughts?
Ooh, that is a good question, because that is a battle I have fought many, many times. When I was in Oregon, the Department of Ed would only count the first two eligibility categories. So if deafblindness was not one or two, that kid was not being counted as deafblind. And honestly, the case I typically make, to a school district, like in that kind of a situation, it's just like explaining the difference between what multiple disability means versus deafblindness, because deafblindness is truly getting at the heart of a dual sensory loss. Like those interventions, those services, those needs, those accommodations are super specific. And if it is not specifically listed that deafblindness is what that child has and what they need, then they're not going to get the appropriate services that they really actually need. And this also has ramifications in some school districts, because if you have 100 kids with deafblindness, but only 10 are being reported, well, guess how much money is going to be allocated for funding for those kids? Like not as much as they actually need. So making a case like that can be really helpful. And again, if you need numbers from the child count specific to your state that you feel would bolster your case, please email me. I will put those together for you. I would love to help you.
And we also just had an article published through the Journal of Special Education where some things that impact identification were listed. And one of the things that's really interesting is that the OSEP numbers couldn't really be used because they're so small. So they use the National Child Count. And I think the more that we've presented at OSEP about this challenge, I think the more that we are aware, the more that then people can really advocate for that deafblindness on their IEPs.
And a final comment from one of our participants, and remember everybody to check the chat field before you run off to get that link. This person is Tony Hollingsworth, who is in the Mississippi Hearing Vision Project to comment. Children born with vision loss are not associated with any child registry, as there is nothing equivalent to the hearing screening at birth. Therefore, those who are identifying hearing loss in each state are not necessarily aware of how to refer to services. Each deaf-blind project in each state has to reach out individually to all of the pediatric ophthalmologists, et cetera, to inform them of the services of the deaf-blind projects. Any comments about that comment?
Yes, and mostly thank you, Tony, for writing that all out and for sharing. Yes, and I think that is where there is so much complexity to this conversation, and there's no easy answer, and why I think some of the common etiologies associated with deafblindness as red flags can be really helpful, because then they're in the back of your mind as EDI coordinators to be, speaking with your audiologists. Okay, well, if this child has charge, or if this child does have a lot of complications due to prematurity, just to keep that in the back of their mind, and with your Guide by Your Side programs as well. But it is a huge task, and state deafblind projects work so hard to find these babies and to build these connections, and it is such a web. And I think the more that we have those honest conversations and really try to dig in and figure it out, the more progress we'll make together.
I really want to thank you, both of you, and to our captioners and our interpreters today. I want to just also mention that for those of us who have worked a lot, myself specifically, in later onset hearing loss identification, a lot of those initiatives are combined under the heading of sensory screening efforts, vision and hearing being combined as a part of those initiatives. Prevent Blindness, which is one of our partners, has some resources that are useful, particularly for the 3 to 5-year-old population, but some guidance for younger levels for vision screening. And that's another set of resources that would be helpful for EDI programs to be aware of when they're interacting with folks who are really coming to the table with that larger question of sensory screening. So just another resource to think about. Thank you, everybody. Look in the chat field for a link there. That link will take you to a quick evaluation of today's webinar, and will also generate a certificate of participation for today's webinar, if that's helpful to you. Remember, this webinar has been recorded. It will appear on our website in the next couple of days, which is infanthearing.org. And keep in mind, those who may not have been in attendance live today, who may benefit from learning some of what we've discussed today, also watch for that email from Sophie Page at Utah State University, who has information for you about the post-EDI conference meeting that Emma was discussing. So, or you can email directly to Emma if you're interested in participating in that. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much.